Hey honeys, and welcome back to the Beesness. We're gonna go ahead and pretend that it's still Tuesday, but of course I jinxed myself last episode by saying that the week before had been hard to find stories. Well, last week was full of them. I could hardly pick which ones were the best, so I just kind of went by gut and juiciness. Here we go, honeys. Here is your Beesness for March 24th through the 30th. Without further ado, let's dive on in, knowing that our source doc is, of course, available in the episode description here. I'll admit, I was a big fan of the sort of section-by-section news-style format I did last week. It very much brought me back to my high school speech days when I was participating in the radio category. Oh, if I had only known then what I would be doing now. Anyways, first up, we've got announcements and discoveries. Last week, disgraced art dealer Inigo Philbrick made a fairly big deal out of announcing his goal to reestablish himself shortly after his release from prison. The background on this story is that he was sentenced for, in the prosecutor's own words, committing, quote, one of the most significant frauds in the art market in history, end quote, for a massive art fraud scam that is estimated to have cost his victims over $86 million. According to Art News, quote, he was captured on the remote South Pacific island of Vanuatu, where he fled in late 2019 as lawsuits, fraud claims, and international asset seizure orders began piling up, end quote. From there, he tried to avoid this bad look by claiming that he thought all filings were civil matters, and thus he was free to roam. He pled guilty to wire fraud in November 2021 and was sentenced to prison in Pennsylvania in May of 2022, where he served less than 4 years of his 7-year sentence. Coming back up to this year, Philbrick was sent to a halfway house in Providence, Rhode Island in January upon his release, and shortly after, a Vanity Fair spread dropped with him looking like the face of quiet luxury, very GQ model style. And we're talking about this one today kind of just because of the sheer arrogance and the cluelessness of this guy, thinking that he's gonna keep on scamming, I guess. As Art News says, quote, in the Vanity Fair story by writer Mark Seal, Philbrick says at one point, quote, the art world is unregulated, end quote. And according to Art News, relied on that opacity to build his business by creating fake identities to sell the same shares in artworks to multiple investors, by borrowing against artworks that he didn't even own, and by playing the offshore shell companies game. While I'm not gonna pretend that he's entirely wrong, the art world definitely has some questionable financial things going on sometimes. You are not the dude to be making these accusations, my friend. Those in glass houses. I also had to laugh aloud in disbelief. His commentary on his prison experience centers entirely on him boo-hooing about how nobody knew what an art dealer is and nobody knew what an art dealer does when he was in there. So there was no recognition of his genius, and it was so disturbing to him. Furthermore, quote, he has admitted to a drug habit and excessive drinking beginning in high school. His attorneys claimed that it's how art deals are done, according to the report, end quote. Again, everybody else also being guilty does not mean that you are less guilty or that you cannot be punished for being guilty. As for what's next, his wife points out that others ought to be held accountable for their roles too. She's not entirely wrong, but she is slightly biased. While former art buyers who worked with him say they are much more cautious or out of the game entirely after this. But for every bad or sad announcement we have today, we have a good one, so here's the other side. A gallery volunteer's sleuthing has led to the reunion of a 16th century altarpiece. Volunteer guide Christine Cluley of Compton Verney, a manor house turned art gallery in the Warwickshire countryside, was intrigued by a pair of 500-year-old panels that had once enclosed an altarpiece lamentation scene. The only knowledge of the artist who made it was that he was a, quote, Franconian master, end quote, aka a Bavarian. 14 years later, after a step-by-step retracing of the work's provenance, she has accomplished multiple things. She has reunited the centerpiece with its wings for a temporary display at Compton Verney, set to run through February 2025. Her research also helped identify the missing centerpiece itself, the Lamentation of Christ, with a group of donors, now held by the National Galleries of Scotland. Finally, Compton Verney is also cautiously putting forward the names of two possible artists after examination of her findings. The first is Hans Bolding, the second, Wolfgang Trott. A bit about the work in question. It was commissioned following the death in 1527 of Casimir Friedrich, the ruler of the Ansbach Principality in the Holy Roman Empire. It is painted on both sides with saints and various symbology associating with them or other Christian concepts. This story is a wonderful reminder that anyone who puts their mind to it can make very impressive and very important contributions to art history. Unfortunately, last week also saw the passing of a few very prominent artists. The first, the post-war sculptor Richard Serra, died at 85 of pneumonia. Says Art News, quote, his public works stand in cities throughout the world, while his sculptures have redefined gallery spaces from Dia Beacon to the Guggenheim Bilbao, end quote. One of his most famous works caused major controversy upon its removal. We will save this story for a future in-depth episode, but essentially he was among the earliest modern sculptors to play with the idea of forcing the body to move around large-size sculptures. The well-known abstract painter of New York skyscrapers, Robert Moskowitz, also died at age 89. According to his own website, he, quote, has been described as a significant link between the abstract expressionists of the New York School and new image painters of the 1970s, end quote. Moskowitz first gained recognition exhibiting at the Leo Castelli Gallery in the early 1960s. Next year, his inclusion in the historic exhibition Art of the Assemblage at the Museum of Modern Art signaled his arrival into contemporary discourse and fame at that time. And closing off announcements and discoveries on a positive note, Barcelona's Sagrada Familia has announced an expected completion date officially. After more than 100 years of construction, with several architects contributing before and after Antoni Gaudí, the site is already a UNESCO Heritage One and the largest unfinished Catholic church in the world. On its completion, it will be the tallest church in the world, topping the Ulm Minster in Germany. The annual report released by the Basilica says, quote, the Chapel of the Assumption is expected to be finished in 2025 and the Tower of Jesus Christ in 2026, end quote. It's noted that the Sagrada Familia had over 4,700,000 visitors in 2023, making it an income of over 137 million, of which 52% went towards the construction. Having once been inside it myself and seen it from the outside a couple times more, this really is an amazing, stunning, thoughtful building. It is one that not only demonstrates Gaudí's engineering prowess, but also the ability of his to connect multiple stories related to the Catholic faith into the facades and other elements of the building. Last week also saw a couple impressive, noteworthy sales. First, Karl Lagerfeld's Paris apartment sold for double its asking price. Lagerfeld himself served as the creative director of Chanel from 1983 until his death in 2019. The apartment sold for $10.8 million to an anonymous buyer despite its only $5.7 million asking price during an auction on the 26th hosted by the Paris Chamber of Commerce as well as real estate broker Groupe Altemis. Lagerfeld used the apartment as a residence and studio space post-renovations, which contradict with the facade of the building to create a feeling of, quote, floating in your own spaceship over a very civilized past, end quote, in the words of New Yorker's John Colapinto. A few details of the space. It is a 2,800 square foot apartment located on the stately Quai Voltaire Street and overlooking both the Seine and the Louvre. The space is luxurious to the max with a garage, 2 cellars, security system, a revolving glass bookcase, and, of course, a designer's size and style dressing room. In a bit more of a humorous and unusual story, a vinyl artwork rejected by Paul McCartney for being, quote, too unflattering is being auctioned for charity. Not how it was originally intended to be. The work was originally a contribution to the art project called Secret 7 Inches, which was relaunched in 2023 after a couple-year hiatus. The group raises money for charity by auctioning off limited edition vinyl records featuring new exclusive artworks from artists all over the world, which are often paired up with songs by some iconic musicians. Here, McCartney was paired with Pipes of Peace. Though each of the 7 songs selected by the project every year receives 100 different pieces of matching artwork, this particular one was apparently too much for McCartney and his crew. The artwork was barred from the Secret 7 auction, so the artist decided to do his own. The work eventually sold for £1,355, with those proceeds going to War Child UK. Last week also saw an announcement that the Broad Museum will be getting quite the expansion. There will be a $100 million addition to its existing building coming soon. The new 55,000 square foot building will be attached to the existing museum via a 3rd floor entryway leading to an open air courtyard with sky views. This will provide a 70% space increase. The new building will be designed by the New York-based firm Diller, Scofido and Renfro, who created the original museum. They expect to break ground early next year, and the project is slated for completion in time for the 2028 Summer Olympics. The museum will stay open during this construction, and admission will continue to be free. So, why it matters? Well, first of all, hell yeah, more art available to all for free. Always a good thing. Also, the additional gallery spaces will allow the museum to significantly increase the amount of modern and contemporary artworks on view, as well as guest gathering and other specific use spaces. It names Andy Warhol, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Jeff Koons, Carol Walker, Colleen Smith, Lauren Halsey, and Patrick Martinez in its press statements as artists who are likely to get a boost in representation in the gallery as a result of this expansion. Another reason is that LA has been very slow to come back from the pandemic, according to the LA Times. They write, quote, "The Broad is one of LA's most popular museums, with more than 5.5 million visitors to date and more than 900,000 guests annually. That number is likely to increase after the expansion, bringing with it a much-needed influx of people looking to shop, dine, and be entertained," end quote. The idea is that this expansion could potentially reinvigorate the immediate surrounding area. It could potentially also reinvigorate the much-hyped but never fully realized Grand Avenue project, which hoped to create a thriving civic and cultural corridor out of the district surrounding the Broad. Also in institutional news, the UK National Portrait Gallery's Nicholas Cullinan was appointed director of the British Museum. So who is Cullinan? He officially received the appointment Thursday of last week. He had been the director of the National Portrait Gallery since 2015, including overseeing a major refurbishment of the building over there. He has previously worked at the Tate Modern in London and at the Met in New York. As he says in the Washington Post, he, quote, looked forward to leading the institution through the most significant transformations, both architectural and intellectual, happening in any museum globally, to continue making the British Museum the most engaged and collaborative it can be, end quote. A bit of necessary background here. This appointment comes after a pretty big scandal and with the museum trying to get itself and its image back together. Says the Washington Post, quote, previous director Hartwig Fischer resigned in August after the museum disclosed that more than 1,800 items were missing in an apparent case of insider theft. Many of the items had been offered for sale online, end quote. The long-standing curator Paul Higgs is facing suits from the museum in high court over the missing items. Museum lawyers say Higgs, quote, abused his position of trust, end quote, to steal pieces from storerooms over the course of a decade, while his own attorneys deny the allegations. Cullinan will take over for the interim director of the British Museum, Mark Jones, who was formerly the head of the Victoria and Albert Museum. So why we care about a new director post-scandal? Well, partially because of the bad look that it gives the museum that this theft happened at all. Art News makes a nice summary of what is currently happening by saying that it is, quote, also tightening its security and inventory records and is also facing renewed and impassioned calls for the repatriation of objects that many have claimed were looted, end quote. This appointment of a new director is sort of the first test to see whether the British Museum can and has recovered from the incident. Lastly, I'm going to leave you honeys with a bit of a thinker. AP News last week drew attention to a fight that centers on protecting the dignity of Michelangelo's David, but also raises questions about the freedom of expression. As AP News puts it, quote, in the current era of the quick buck, curators worry the marble statue's religious and political significance is being diminished by the thousands of refrigerator magnets and other souvenirs sold around Florence, focusing on David's genitalia, end quote. Of course, we have two sides in this story. The yay-peen side, as I have decided to call them, consists of various small businesses making goods featuring part or whole of the statue, particularly queer creators who use his hands, genitals, or other sensual elements of the statue in their designs. Many artists look to this David hoping for inspiration, stylistic practice through copy, and other reasons. So, AP News says, quote, experts say the aggressive stance could backfire, discouraging the licensing of Italy's artworks, a source of revenue, while also limiting the reproduction of masterpieces that serve as cultural ambassadors. The nay-peen side, as I have decided to call it, is led by a much more curatorial point of view. In particular, by the Galleria dell'Accademia's director, Cecily Holberg. She has positioned herself as David's defender from the start of her job in 2015. She's been quick to go after those profiteering from his image in ways that she finds, quote, debasing. The publication notes that she is a bit of a David herself in this Goliath fight against reproductions of the statue's image. She particularly goes after Davids which are engaged in obscene acts or with obscene hand gestures, such as raised middle fingers. Since 2017, her strategy has included the state's attorney office in Florence. She has launched a series of court cases based on violation of Italy's landmark cultural heritage code, which, quote, protects artistic treasures from disparaging and unauthorized commercial use, end quote. Her success has led to requests for information and advice by other museums across the world hoping to achieve the same limitations on their own holdings. So what is the big deal with the peen? Well, decisions in favor of the museum, quote, challenge a widely held practice that intellectual property rights are protected for a specified period before entering the public domain, the artist's lifetime plus 70 years, according to the Berne Convention, signed by more than 180 countries, including Italy, end quote, says AP News. So this is significant because Italy and the museum itself are essentially deciding that they have, or they just are, an exception. The code is kind of unusual in itself. It basically extends copyright to owning museums and institutions of artworks into perpetuity. And European courts have debated whether Italy's law violates a 2019 European Union directive stating that any artwork no longer protected by copyright falls into the public domain. So the issue is a little, political, economic, a lot about licensing. However, there's also quite a bit of censorship concerns here. This case really forces us to ask, should museums be the only ones to decide how, when, with what edits a work of art can appear? So, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of parody. According to Thomas C. Danziger, an art market lawyer based in New York, quote, it raises not just legal issues, but also philosophical issues. What does cultural patrimony mean? How much of a stranglehold do you want to give institutions over ideas and images that are in the public domain? End quote. He points to a Warhol series that was inspired by Da Vinci's Last Supper as a derivative example and a confounding point of this question. Obviously, if Warhol had not been allowed to do any copying, that masterpiece of his wouldn't exist. The question may not be so much what is within the limits, but what would we miss from what may be developed outside of them? All right, honeys, there's our episode for the week. Hope you've enjoyed our Beesness. We will have a full-length episode dropping as soon as possible. My goal is by end of day tomorrow. I will talk to you all soon. Have a great weekend. Take care of yourselves. This podcast was created, produced, written, hosted, edited, and fact-checked by Master's graduate Celia Bugno. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all of your favorite streaming platforms as well as your social medias.